The night had started like any other on The Late Show, with Stephen radiating his signature charm, cracking jokes, and effortlessly commanding the crowd's attention. But as soon as Elon Musk took his seat, a subtle tension crept into the air. Was this going to be another lighthearted conversation about futuristic technology, or would it unravel into something far more explosive? The audience leaned in, sensing that tonight's show might be one they would not forget. It all started with a simple question, one that seemed harmless at first. But as Stephen pressed further, his tone took on an edge. Was he challenging Musk, or outright ridiculing him? The subject, colonizing Mars, a grand vision or an escapist fantasy? Stephen wasted no time in framing it as the latter, painting Musk as an out-of-touch billionaire lost in a world of impossible dreams, while real problems on Earth remained unresolved. But was it fair? Was Musk truly detached, or was he simply seeing possibilities the rest of the world could not grasp? Elon's responses, calculated and unwavering, only fueled the tension. He was not one to shrink under scrutiny, but tonight, the scrutiny was relentless. Stephen, emboldened by the audience's laughter and approval, leaned into his criticisms, highlighting the stark divide between the billionaire's ambitions and the struggles of everyday people. Was Musk ignoring the suffering of millions while chasing science fiction? Was he running away from Earth's problems instead of fixing them? The crowd cheered as Stephen's words struck their mark, but something in Musk's expression shifted. He had tolerated the jabs, the skepticism, the playful mockery. But now, the line between entertainment and provocation had blurred. He was not just a guest on a talk show anymore. He was a target. And then, the shift happened. Musk, with his usual detached demeanor, began turning the tables. If Stephen wanted to challenge him, then he would challenge Stephen. Why was a talk show host, someone who thrived on entertainment and performance, suddenly positioning himself as the moral compass of society? Did he really believe he understood the complexities of innovation better than those who built the future? Was his humor a shield for something deeper? Perhaps his own inability to contribute to real change? The energy in the room shifted. The laughter softened, and the tension thickened. Stephen, for all his quick wit and stage presence, was no longer controlling the narrative. Musk was no longer playing defense. He was striking back, questioning the very premise of the discussion. What had started as an amusing exchange now felt like a battle of egos, a collision of two vastly different worldviews. And just like that, the night was no longer about a billionaire's dreams of Mars. It was about something much bigger, a fight for intellectual dominance, a struggle between idealism and pragmatism, between showmanship and substance. But who would come out on top? That remained to be seen. Would Stephen regain control, or had he finally met someone who would not bend to the rhythm of late-night television? The audience held their breath, waiting for what would come next. And in that silence, in that unspoken anticipation, the real battle had only just begun. Stephen was no stranger to difficult guests, but there was something different about this encounter. He had anticipated resistance, even some arrogance from Musk. But what he had not expected was this sudden reversal of power. The audience had been on his side just moments ago, laughing at his pointed jabs, reveling in the comedic takedown of a billionaire lost in the stars. But now there was hesitation, uncertainty. Had he pushed too far? Or was Musk simply more adept at dismantling his arguments than he had realized? Musk did not raise his voice, nor did he break his usual composed demeanor, but there was an intensity behind his words that cut through the theatrics. If Stephen wanted to frame him as an out-of-touch billionaire, then why stop at him? Was the entire entertainment industry not just as disconnected? Late-night television thrived on spectacle, not solutions. Was it not hypocritical for a talk show host to criticize others for not addressing real-world problems while sitting comfortably in a studio built on entertainment and applause? Stephen's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, a moment, so brief that most would have missed it. But Musk had seen it, and more importantly, the audience had felt it. The dynamic had shifted. What had started as playful skepticism was now something much sharper, a battle of credibility. Who had the right to lecture whom? Was it the billionaire shaping the future of technology, or the entertainer shaping public perception? Stephen, ever the professional, quickly regained his composure. If Musk wanted to turn this into a debate about hypocrisy, he was ready for it. The show was about entertainment, yes, but that did not mean it could not challenge ideas, hold the powerful accountable, and give voice to concerns shared by millions. Was it really unfair to question whether Musk's vision for humanity was one that included everyone, or was it just a playground for the elite? But Musk was not backing down. The space race of the past had been driven by governments, by nations, competing for dominance, yet now it was being led by private industry, by individuals willing to risk everything to push civilization forward. Did Stephen truly believe progress should be dictated by bureaucracy and public opinion, rather than innovation and risk-taking? Would the world ever move forward if visionaries had to constantly stop and answer to critics who contributed nothing but skepticism? The audience was no longer just laughing along. They were listening. Some nodded in agreement with Stephen's perspective, while others considered Musk's retort with a new sense of curiosity. The debate had transcended late-night banter. It was no longer just about Mars or billionaires or television. It had become a reflection of a much larger divide between those who dreamed of change and those who questioned the price of that change. Stephen leaned forward, his eyes locked, onto Musk's, refusing to cede any ground. He had interviewed countless powerful figures before, challenged politicians, grilled celebrities, and sparred with intellectuals. But this was different. Musk was not playing by the usual rules. He was not here to be entertained or to provide amusing sound bites. He was here to win. And yet something about the way Musk spoke, his sheer confidence, made it clear. He believed every word he was saying. He was not here for validation. He did not care if the audience cheered or booed. And that made him dangerous. The conversation was no longer just heating up. It was on the verge of boiling over. And the audience, caught between two titans unwilling to back down, could only watch as the inevitable explosion drew closer. The tension in the studio had reached an almost unbearable level. Stephen, who had always prided himself on controlling the narrative, was now in a position he rarely found himself in, on the defensive. Musk was no ordinary guest. He was not a politician trying to dodge controversy or a Hollywood star looking to promote a movie. He was a man who wielded power not through words, but through the sheer force of his accomplishments. And now, he was using that power to push back. But Stephen was not ready to surrender just yet. If Musk wanted to challenge his credibility, then he would challenge Musk's. The audience had come to see a battle, and he was not about to disappoint them. With a measured pause, he leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting into one of controlled amusement. If Musk was so certain that he was pushing civilization forward, then why was he so unwilling to answer for the consequences of his ambitions? Was it not true that his companies had been accused of mistreating workers, of engaging in ethically questionable business practices? Was it not true that his promises often outpaced reality? That he had made grand declarations about self-driving cars, hyperloops, and brain implants, yet so many of these remained unfinished or plagued with issues? Was this really a man shaping the future? Or was he simply another billionaire making bold claims to keep the world hanging on his every word? The audience erupted in applause, and for a brief moment Stephen regained the upper hand. This was familiar territory, holding the powerful accountable, exposing the cracks beneath their carefully constructed images. And Musk, for all his intelligence and defiance, had cracks. All Stephen needed to do was widen them. But Musk did not flinch. If Stephen thought he could reduce him to a list of corporate controversies and delayed projects, then he was underestimating just how deeply Musk believed in his own vision. His companies were not about press releases or pleasing the media. They were about taking risks, about pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Did people truly believe progress came without failure? Did they think those who changed the world never stumbled along the way? His words carried weight, not because they were rehearsed or crafted for applause, but because they spoke to something undeniable. Every great innovator had been doubted, criticized, even ridiculed. And yet, history did not remember the skeptics. It remembered those who dared to push forward despite them. The energy in the room shifted again, the cheers for Stephen now mingling with murmurs of consideration. Musk was not playing by the usual rules of late-night television, where guests were expected to sit back and absorb the host's carefully placed barbs. He was fighting back, and in doing so, he was forcing the audience to think, really think, about what was being said. Stephen, however, was not finished. If Musk wanted to play the role of the visionary, then let us talk about vision. Because for all of his talk about progress, about humanity's future, there was one glaring contradiction: his wealth. Was it not true that while he spoke of advancing civilization, he had the power to solve problems right now? Could he not single-handedly eliminate hunger, fund education, fix the very issues he claimed were mere obstacles on the way to Mars? And yet, he had chosen not to. The audience roared, in approval. This was the knockout punch they had been waiting for, the moment where Musk's carefully constructed persona would finally crack under the weight of its own contradictions. And for a split second, it seemed like Stephen had done it. But then, Musk smiled. It was not an admission of defeat, nor was it an attempt to brush off the question. It was the expression of a man who knew exactly where this was going, who had anticipated every possible criticism long before stepping onto that stage. And then he spoke. Whatever he said, it was enough to wipe the smug confidence off Stephen's face. The audience, so sure that their host had won the exchange, now found themselves questioning everything. Had they been too quick to judge? Had they let their own biases blind them to a different perspective? Musk had done more than just defend himself. He had flipped the entire conversation on its head. And for the first time in a long time, Stephen Colbert, the master of late-night debate, was struggling to keep control. The battle was far from over. And the next move? It belonged to Musk. A heavy silence settled over the room, the kind that only comes when an entire audience is forced to reconsider what they thought they knew. Musk had not just parried Stephen's attack. He had exposed the shallowness of the argument itself. It was not a matter of whether he could single-handedly fix the world's problems. It was a matter of why that expectation existed in the first place. Why was it that billionaires were seen as the only solution to society's failures? Did governments, institutions, and the public bear no responsibility? Was real progress supposed to come from one man's wallet, or from a collective effort to push civilization forward? Stephen's smirk had disappeared. He was not used to being caught off guard like this. His entire persona was built on controlling the pace of the conversation, using humor to steer the discussion in a way that left his guests fumbling for words. But Musk was not fumbling. He was methodical, composed, and worst of all, he was making sense. The crowd, which had been so eager to cheer for Stephen's jabs, was now split. Some still clung to the host's framing of Musk as an out-of-touch billionaire, but others were beginning to see something different. A man who was not just defending himself, but challenging the very way these conversations were framed. Was it really fair to single out one individual when the problems Stephen was bringing up were systemic? Could one person ever do enough to satisfy those who demanded more? But Stephen was not done. If Musk wanted to challenge the premise of the conversation, then it was time to push back even harder. The conversation pivoted to power. Real power. Musk spoke of pushing humanity forward. But was he not just another figure hoarding influence, dictating the direction of the future without the consent of the people who would be most affected by it? He was not an elected leader. He did not answer to a democracy. He made decisions that shaped industries, economies, even the future of human civilization itself, yet no one had voted for him. Was that not dangerous? For the first time, there was an audible shift in the audience. This was a question that resonated. Musk's projects were not just about technology, they were about control. Who got to decide what the future looked like? Who got left behind in that vision? Was it truly about progress, or was it just another form of unchecked power disguised as innovation? Musk's expression did not change, but there was something different in the way he responded. He had been expecting skepticism, even hostility, but this was not just about Mars or corporate ambitions anymore. This was an accusation that went to the core of who he was, a man who had spent his life breaking through barriers, only to be told that his success itself was the problem. And for the first time in the exchange, there was emotion behind his words. Was it frustration, a sense of injustice, or something deeper, a realization that no matter what he built, no matter what problems he tried to solve, there would always be those who framed him as the villain? Stephen could sense it. He had struck something real, and now it was time to press even harder. He painted a picture, one of billionaires making decisions in rooms the public never saw, of a world where innovation did not necessarily mean fairness, where progress for some often meant hardship for others. Musk might believe he was shaping the future, but who was shaping Musk? Who held him accountable? If he was allowed to dictate the next century of human civilization, then was that not just a new form of aristocracy, one built not on bloodlines, but on wealth, technology, and unchecked ambition? The crowd erupted. This was what they had come for. The takedown. The moment where Stephen would expose Musk as nothing more than another powerful figure hiding behind grand ideas. But Musk did not react the way they expected. There was no anger, no outburst, no attempt to redirect the conversation. Instead, there was a pause, one that felt deliberate. And then, with a calmness that cut through the noise, he delivered a response that made Stephen hesitate. The host, always quick with a retort, found himself momentarily without one, because, once again, Musk had done what no one expected. He had not just answered the question, he had turned it around. And suddenly, the audience was no longer just looking at him. They were looking at Stephen. The moment lingered, stretching longer than Stephen had anticipated. He was used to the rhythm of late-night television, the quick exchanges, the clever comebacks, the applause breaks that signaled the audience's approval. But now, something was off. The reaction was not as immediate as before. Musk had shifted the weight of the argument, and suddenly Stephen found himself in a position he rarely occupied, being scrutinized just as much as his guest. For all of his sharp critiques about power and accountability, Musk had thrown back a question that had changed the room's energy entirely. If unchecked influence was such a danger, then what about the media? What about talk show hosts who shaped narratives, who decided which guests would be praised and which would be torn down? Was there a difference between a billionaire steering the future through technology and an entertainer steering public opinion with selective framing? The question cut deeper than the audience expected. It was easy to cheer for the takedown of a wealthy tycoon, but now the dynamic had shifted. Stephen, always the one in control, was now facing scrutiny himself. Was he truly exposing hypocrisy, or was he simply another powerful figure playing his role, deciding who deserved applause and who deserved ridicule? Stephen had built a career on holding the powerful accountable, but did that include himself? The air in the room grew heavier. Stephen, always quick to recover, leaned forward, recalibrating. He was not about to lose this exchange, not after he had come so close to forcing Musk into a corner. If Musk wanted to question the role of the media, then let us talk about it. It Was true that talk show hosts held influence, but they were not the ones launching rockets, buying social media platforms, or setting the course for entire industries. It was not the media's job to remain silent when powerful figures made decisions that affected millions. Musk might call it selective framing, but was it not the responsibility of journalists, entertainers, and cultural critics to ask these questions? If they did not challenge the powerful, who would? The audience stirred again, sensing Stephen regaining his footing. But Musk did not flinch. He had expected this response. If Stephen truly believed in questioning power, then why was it always directed in the same direction? Why did the media only seem interested in tearing down certain figures while elevating others? Was it really about truth, or was it about maintaining control over which ideas were acceptable? It was a question that no one had expected to hear, especially not on Stephen's own show. The audience reaction was no longer one-sided. Some clapped, others murmured in uncertainty. Musk was not just defending himself, he was forcing them to think about the system itself. The show had started as a battle of wit and charm, but it had now become something more dangerous. Stephen felt it too. His usual techniques were not working. Musk was not rattled. He was not panicking. He was doing something far worse. He was exposing a flaw in the game itself. But Stephen was not ready to concede. If Musk wanted to play this game, then let us take it to the next level. And so he pivoted again. If Musk wanted to talk about narratives and selective outrage, then what about his own? Was it not true that whenever he faced criticism, he framed himself as a victim of the media, of politicians, of those who simply did not understand his vision? Was it not convenient that every failure, every controversy, could be brushed aside as nothing more than the world trying to stop him? Was that not just another form of deflection? The audience erupted again, this time more assured in their cheers. Stephen had found his opening. If Musk wanted to challenge the media's influence, then he had to answer for his own. But Musk did not back down. Instead, he gave the most unexpected response of the night. He laughed, not a forced, defensive laugh. A real one. Because, in his eyes, Stephen had just proven his point. The audience quieted. The momentum that had just returned to Stephen now felt unsteady again. Musk was not reacting with anger or frustration. He was reacting like a man who had just been given exactly what he wanted, and Stephen knew it. The balance of power had shifted once more. And now for the first time it was clear. This was not a battle Stephen could win as easily as he had expected. The laughter was a calculated move. It was not the nervous chuckle of someone caught off guard, nor the hollow amusement of a man scrambling to maintain composure. It was something far more dangerous, an indication that Musk had just maneuvered the conversation exactly where he wanted it. Stephen hesitated for only a moment, but that moment was enough. The audience, once so firmly in his corner, now sat in uneasy silence. Some still cheered out of habit, but others were beginning to realize something had changed. Musk was not losing control of the conversation. If anything, he was thriving in it. And then he went for the throat. The argument had started as a clash of ideologies, a predictable back and forth between a billionaire with a messianic complex and a talk show host with a knack for deflating egos. But now it was something else entirely. Musk had taken the initial criticisms leveled against him and turned them into a larger, far more uncomfortable question. Who really controlled the narrative? Was he, the billionaire with tangible influence over the future of technology, truly the most powerful force in the room? Or was it the one who shaped public perception, the one who decided which stories would be told and which would be ignored? Stephen saw the trap too late. He had been so focused on pressing Musk into a corner that he had not realized he had wandered into one himself. Musk's response was not defensive. It was pointed. If the media's role was to hold the powerful accountable, then where was the accountability for them? Who fact-checked the fact-checkers? Who ensured that public outrage was not simply another tool used to manipulate perception? Was it not convenient that certain figures were always painted as villains, while others, no less flawed, were given the benefit of the doubt? The audience was no longer reacting in unison. Some murmured in agreement, while others shifted in their seats. They had come expecting to watch Musk struggle to justify his ambitions, but now they were watching something entirely different. A debate about who truly had control over the way the world saw itself. Stephen attempted to pivot. Again, Musk was a man with unchecked influence over industries that shaped everyday life: transportation, communication, artificial intelligence. He was not the underdog here. This was not some grand revelation about the unseen powers of late-night television. This was a man who had more money than most countries trying to frame himself as the victim. But Musk did not budge. Instead, he pressed even harder. If he had unchecked influence, then why was he constantly under fire? Why was every misstep amplified, every controversy dissected with an intensity that politicians and media conglomerates rarely faced? Why was it that, despite all his power, he still had to fight for control over his own narrative? And more importantly, why did Stephen and those like him always insist that the only acceptable role for someone like Musk was to sit there, take the criticism, and say nothing in return? The audience was now caught between two realities. On one hand, Stephen had been relentless in his questioning, forcing Musk to answer for his actions in a way few ever did. But on the other, Musk was pointing out something that many had quietly considered but never spoken aloud. Was late-night television really about exposing the truth? Or was it just another performance, another system built to reinforce the audience's existing beliefs rather than challenge them? The tension was undeniable. Musk had transformed from the defensive billionaire into the man forcing everyone in the room to ask themselves whether they were truly independent thinkers or just playing their part in a scripted reaction. Stephen could feel the shift. The certainty he had relied on for years, the knowledge that the audience would always be with him, was starting to waver. He had pressed Musk harder than most guests, but in doing so, he had opened a door that could not be closed. Musk leaned back, calm, composed, entirely in control. He was not winning by yelling. He was winning by forcing Stephen to defend himself, in ways he had never had to before. The night was no longer about a billionaire dodging accountability. It was about the nature of influence itself. And Stephen, for the first time in a long time, was starting to realize that he had underestimated his opponent. Stephen could feel it slipping. The grip he had always maintained over his audience, the seamless control of the conversation, the unshakable confidence that no guest could turn the tables on him. Musk had done something rare, something almost unheard of on late-night television. He had taken the attack and reshaped it, forcing Stephen to defend himself in front of an audience that had come expecting to cheer his every move. For the first time in the exchange, Stephen was no longer just the host challenging power. He was power being challenged, but he was not going to let this unravel further. He leaned forward, his expression tightening just slightly, and began to push back. Musk might have landed some surprising blows, but that did not change the facts. Billionaires did not get to play the victim. They did not get to pretend they were unfairly persecuted just because someone dared to ask them tough questions. The media was not the enemy here. It was a necessary force, a check on those who operated in the shadows with far more influence than the public would ever truly understand. Musk listened, nodding slightly, as if considering the point. But Stephen knew better. He had seen this before. A guest feigning thoughtfulness before delivering their next blow. And sure enough, it came. Musk did not outright dismiss Stephen's argument. That would have been too easy, too predictable. Instead, he turned it around, asking whether Stephen truly believed in holding power accountable, or just certain types of power. Had Stephen ever gone after the media conglomerates that controlled his own show with the same intensity he went after tech billionaires? Did he apply the same relentless questioning to the advertisers and corporate executives who dictated what could and could not be said on television? Or was it safer, easier, to attack figures like Musk, people who, despite their wealth, operated outside of traditional media influence? The words hit harder than Stephen expected. The room did not erupt into applause. The usual rhythm of a late-night takedown was gone. Instead, a murmur ran through the audience, a sign that some of them were considering the question. Stephen had spent his career building an image of someone who spoke truth to power, someone unafraid to challenge the elite. But Musk had just done the unthinkable. He had forced the audience to question whether Stephen himself was part of the elite he so often criticized. This was not just about ego. This was about control. And for the first time Stephen could feel his slipping. But he was not done. If Musk wanted to talk about influence, then let us talk about it. Musk controlled entire industries: transportation, space exploration, artificial intelligence. He had a level of power that extended far beyond what any talk show host could dream of. If he wanted to claim he was being unfairly targeted, then perhaps he should look at the people who had no voice at all: the workers in his factories, the competitors who had been crushed under the weight of his business empire, the individuals whose lives were shaped by his decisions without ever having a say in them. Musk smiled slightly, a knowing expression. That unsettled Stephen more than he cared to admit. Because that smile meant one thing: Musk had been expecting this argument, and he was ready for it. He leaned in, delivering his next counter with the precision of a man who had been in more high-stakes battles than Stephen could count. Was it not convenient, he asked, that whenever someone in his position tried to push boundaries, they were accused of being too powerful? And yet, when legacy institutions, governments, media networks, multinational corporations wielded their own unchecked influence, it was simply accepted as the natural order of things? Was it really about accountability? Or was it about keeping certain figures in check while allowing others to operate without question? The room was silent. Stephen could feel the weight of it now. Musk had stopped playing defense. He had turned the entire discussion into something else, something far more unpredictable. This was no longer about whether Musk was an unchecked billionaire with too much influence. This was about whether Stephen and his audience had been playing into a narrative without realizing it. And that was dangerous. Stephen needed to regain control. But how? Musk had positioned himself perfectly. Just skeptical enough to be intriguing, just combative enough to be entertaining. If Stephen came at him too hard now, it would look like he was flailing, desperate to regain the upper hand. If he hesitated, he risked letting Musk dictate the rest of the exchange. There was only one way forward. Stephen had to make Musk expose himself. He had to force him into a moment where the mask slipped, where the carefully constructed arguments crumbled under scrutiny. And so he went for the one thing that always rattled men like Musk: their ego. Stephen had spent years refining his craft, mastering the subtle art of steering an interview exactly where he wanted. He had taken on world leaders, corporate giants, and cultural icons, and through it all, he had maintained his ability to keep the upper hand. But now, he was against an opponent who did not play by the usual rules. Musk had taken the punches, absorbed them, and twisted them back with unnerving ease. But Stephen still had one advantage. He knew how to find the cracks in a guest's armor. He knew that every man who held as much power as Musk carried with him one fatal flaw: the need to be seen as a genius, the singular force shaping the future. It was more than pride. It was identity. So Stephen did what he did best. He played the long game. He softened, leaning back slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make it seem like he was shifting from an attack to a genuine question. He framed his words carefully, as if conceding that maybe Musk had a point. Maybe he was right about the hypocrisy of certain institutions. Maybe he was right about power structures. And then, with a perfectly calculated pause, Stephen asked the question that changed everything. Was it possible, he wondered, that Musk's greatest enemy was not the media, not government regulations, not even the entrenched elites he so often criticized? Was it, in fact, himself? The words landed like a quiet bomb. Musk, who had been so measured, so controlled, barely reacted at first. But Stephen saw it, the shift in his posture, the way his jaw tightened ever so slightly. Stephen continued, seizing the moment. He painted a picture of Musk as a man who had built an empire not just on innovation, but on sheer force of will. A man who had convinced the world he was the only one capable of taking humanity to the stars. The only one, with the vision to push civilization forward. But what if that belief, what if that unshakable confidence, was the very thing holding him back? What if, despite all his brilliance, Musk was his own worst enemy? Musk let out a short laugh, but it was not the confident, dismissive kind. It was something else, something that suggested he was caught between amusement and irritation. The audience had shifted now. They were leaning in, waiting to see how Musk would respond. For the first time since the exchange began, he had been put on the defensive, not with an attack, but with a question that forced him to confront something deeper. And that was exactly what Stephen wanted. Because if Musk did what Stephen suspected he would, if he let his frustration slip, if he lashed out, then suddenly everything that had happened before would be reframed. The audience would forget the moments when Musk had controlled the conversation. They would forget the points he had scored. They would see only the moment when he cracked. And then, it happened. Musk's response was sharper than before. His tone, more clipped. He dismissed the premise outright, but there was something in the way he did it. Something defensive. Something that suggested the question had gotten to him. Stephen pushed just a little further, just enough to make Musk feel the weight of the moment. The audience was watching. The cameras were rolling. The legacy of this exchange would be defined by what happened next, and Musk knew it. His frustration escalated, the carefully maintained facade giving way to something raw. And then, in a single moment of unguarded frustration, he snapped back. Not just at Stephen, but at the entire premise of the show itself. He turned the attack on the very nature of late-night television, on the performative outrage, on the illusion that these interviews were ever about real accountability. He called out the entire spectacle for what it was. A game designed not to seek truth, but to entertain, to reinforce pre-existing beliefs, to make the audience feel good about themselves without ever challenging them. The air in the room changed. Some in the audience laughed uncomfortably. Others murmured, uncertain of how to react. Musk had done something unexpected. He had not just defended himself. He had gone after the very foundation of the format, and in doing so, he had put Stephen in the position of being just another player in the game. But Stephen was not about to let Musk define the narrative. He had seen guests try to do this before. Turn the conversation into a referendum on the media itself, hoping that by discrediting the platform, they could avoid accountability. But this was different. This was not just an argument about fairness. This was Musk trying to dismantle the entire premise of what made these exchanges meaningful. And Stephen could not let that stand. He straightened, no longer playing into the casual conversational tone. If Musk wanted to talk about illusion, about performance, then let us talk about it. Let us talk about the carefully curated image that Musk had built, the persona of the maverick genius who stood apart from the corrupt systems of power. Let us talk about how, despite his claims of being an outsider, he had worked those very systems to his advantage time and time again. Musk stared at him, unblinking. For the first time in the conversation, there was no easy counter, no witty retort, no deflection. And Stephen knew in that moment that he had turned the tide. Stephen took a deep breath, sensing that the final moments of this interview would define it. Musk had tried to pivot the conversation, tried to make it about something larger, about the media, about public perception. But now, with every word he spoke, he was revealing more of his true character, his need to maintain control at all costs, even if it meant tearing down the very system that had given him his platform. Stephen knew he had one last chance. He could either allow Musk to dominate the moment and walk away with the last word, or he could make it clear that no one, no matter how powerful, was above scrutiny. Musk, who had once been so poised, was now visibly rattled. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed tightly over his chest. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, frustration, but also a hint of something more vulnerable. For the first time, he wasn't the master of the conversation. He wasn't the one controlling the narrative, and that made him dangerous. But Stephen wasn't intimidated. He seized the moment, not with a bombastic final salvo, but with a calm, measured statement. He addressed Musk directly, acknowledging that the billionaire's accomplishments were indeed remarkable. But that didn't mean he was above being questioned. It didn't mean he was immune to criticism. It didn't mean the world had to bend to his whims simply because he had built something extraordinary. The tone was not confrontational. Instead, it was straightforward, as though Stephen were reminding Musk of a simple truth, that no one, not even someone who had changed the world, was exempt from being held accountable for their actions. And it was at that moment that the tension in the room hit its peak. Musk, who had been playing the game of media and public opinion for years, could no longer keep up the charade. His facade of unshakable confidence cracked, revealing a man who was far less certain than he appeared. His dismissive demeanor faltered, and in that brief, fleeting second, Stephen knew he had won. Without warning, Musk stood up. The studio fell silent, the audience unsure of how to react. And then Musk spoke, his voice tight with frustration, his words cutting through the air like a blade. He declared that this conversation was over, that he had had enough, and with that he turned on his heel and stormed off the set. The audience, still in shock, sat in stunned silence for a moment. But Stephen, ever the professional, was unshaken. He gave a small, knowing smile to the camera, then turned to the audience with a wry comment, making light of the situation and quickly restoring the mood in the room. It was as though nothing had ever happened, and Stephen had once again come out on top. The show ended on a high note, with Stephen thanking the audience for their support, his usual grace intact. But there was no denying it. This was a night that would go down in history. Musk, who had come in with all the bravado of a billionaire used to being untouchable, had been humbled, and Stephen Colbert, the man who had become a symbol of holding the powerful accountable, had emerged victorious. It was a triumph, not just for Stephen, but for the very idea that no one, no matter how influential or wealthy, was beyond reproach. The show might have ended, but the conversation had just begun. And as the credits rolled, one thing was certain. This would be the episode everyone would remember.